I didn't even say anything. You say it's good, huh? Just the scratching is enough to... Okay, sounds all right? Okay. I don't know what you're expecting. I know it's Halloween, and you were thinking maybe there's going to be a bunch of candy tonight. That's why you're all showing up. I have all tricks, but no treats. Such is the Dharma. Okay, we're in chapter 10 of the Avatamsaka Sutra. Bodhisattvas ask for clarification. And we just finished the section on question that Manjushri poses, why some people, when they hear the teachings, they hear the Dharma, which is actually quite special and rare. It's not easy. We're all exposed to it here almost daily. If you go to any of the way places, the sutras are always being lectured, either directly like we're doing tonight or Zoom or online. I think Heng Sure is doing something right now from Australia, besides feeding birds. I talked to him today, and we wanted to talk about writing, but I had to wait for a half an hour while he fed all these birds. Oh, this bird and that bird, now watch, and he'd throw things up in the air, and the bird would catch it like a baseball player. And, can we talk about the text? Yeah, and then there's this bird. Finally, we got to it. But nonetheless, he's talking today, and then I think he will lecture tomorrow also on the Avatamsaka. We've been lecturing, looking into the Avatamsaka for, since 1976, 1977. That was the text that we took on our bowing pilgrimage. And I'm embarrassed to say that even after, nearly 50 years? Wow. I still feel like I'm just scratching the surface of this text. So if you want to have a lifelong endeavor of mind and spirit, there's nothing better you can do than to go into this text, the Avatamsaka, and do it unassisted by AI. Use your own cognitive wherewithal to go after it. In any event, Manjushri's question last time was people get to hear this sometimes really directly and profoundly, and yet they can't seem to get free. They can't seem to change and become awakened. Why is that? And last week's passage was what he calls shiedai, which was laxness or laxity. And we went into that with some detail about what that meant. And the texts are very interesting. Just to summarize, there's laxity of just being lazy, indolent. The second level of laxity, anybody remember what that was? Now don't look up, just remember, just see if you remember. What was it? Huh? A defeatism or discouragement. In other words, you sell yourself short and say, I can't do that, I'm no good at this. I've tried meditation, I've tried bowing, studying text. I'm no good at it, and therefore you sell yourself short, and it's actually a kind of laxity. So instead of persevering with difficulty, you pull back. But the third one was the most interesting, and this Sanskrit text talks about this, is, since you're on a roll, what's the third one? Yeah, busyness. Busyness, especially worldly busyness, wheeling and dealing in the world, which seems to be aimed at success and virtuous accomplishment. From the spiritual side, it can actually be a kind of laxity or laziness. So it's a kind of escapism from addressing the questions that lead to cultivation. And those we're going to a little bit tonight. But obviously the big question, if we look at the Buddha's life story, was this question of mortality, that we are born only to die, and there's this brief interval in between. And how does one then make sense? How does one engage and do anything at all when this is the thing that hangs over not only all of humankind, but all of living things, and even planets and stars and galaxies? There's nothing that isn't subject to this coming into being, abiding, decrepitude, aging, white hair, whatever you want to call it, and then finally gone. So then the other thing that motivated the Buddha was this overwhelming sense of compassion and empathy he felt for the widespread difficulty and suffering in the world among people, among animals, and so forth, and wanting to, in some way or another, alleviate that. So it was both the search for an answer, which you could say was search for prajna or wisdom, and the motivation of compassion that were the two driving questions. So the next passage goes on, and we'll start that tonight, but I just wanted to, if we could, frame the chapter a little bit. I don't know if you can see in your text, I'm just looking. Tonight we're going to start on, let me see if I can get this thing working. My computer is like frozen. Huh. Can somebody hand me a text? I have a text here, but it's locked in. Can you get another? Okay. So I'm looking at about page 14 or 15. Oh, we're further along. Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, page 21, I'm looking at here, page 21 in the text. But if you look at the beginning, you'll see the title is Pusa Wunming. Wunming is to ask for clarification. So generally, I talked about this a little bit, but it's worth mentioning again. The asking is usually referring to difficulties. So the questions are rising from difficulties, from issues that aren't easy or not at all clear. And clarification then is the answer to these difficulties. And I mentioned before that clarification also means, it can be translated as brightness. So they ask for brightening, or they ask for light to shine on this situation because it dispels darkness. And here's the darkness is the doubts of the questioners. Now I want to be clear about the text. Although the light or the answers dispel the darkness of the doubts, some doubts are actually light producing. I'm sorry to say that. So in the text, in the commentaries, the teachers make a difference between what they call constructive doubt and destructive doubt. And this is basically constructive doubt. They're asking for clarification. They're already coming from a ground of deep understanding. They're all holders of pure precepts. They're all practicing meditation and the 6 paramitas and so forth. And yet there's doubts that are leading to light that they're asking about. And so Manjushri and then 9 leaders, he asked basically 9 in sequence, mutually clarify these difficult questions for one another, and they taking turns. One commentator said it's sort of like the block and pestle or the block and mallet. They thoroughly examine the principles. They hit these things back and forth in a lively discussion. And they do this, it's very clear, it seems as if they're doing it for themselves, but already they're bodhisattvas, which means they have a great deal of understanding and brightness. Well, actually what they're doing it for the sake of masses of sentient beings, not just for themselves. And it's not just to have this out as an answer, but it also clarifies for them how they go about doing the work that bodhisattvas do, which to engage in the world of difficulty, turmoil, of suffering, and try to rescue, liberate, lead, or inspire other living beings to escape from this suffering. So the prose section, if you notice in here, page 21, where we're starting tonight. At that time, Manjushri Bodhisattva asked Dharma leader Bodhisattva. Last time it was who? Who was the last Bodhisattva that was the hammer or the mallet? What was his name, her name? Nobody. Who? It is really fun. So the people that answer the questions are wearing masks. And the people that aren't talking aren't wearing masks. This is really hard for me because I'm entering that last student decrepitude, and my ears are not as good as they used to be. So speak a little louder if you would. Well, who was the last one? Who? Vigorous leader, right? Yeah, encounter. So this leader is called Dharma leader. In any event, the prose section is really bringing up the questions. So there's a pattern here. This text can see like wonderful, you can go at it, but there's actually a kind of a rhetorical or philosophical pattern here. So if you look at the prose section, you'll see it's all questions. At that time, Manjushri Bodhisattva asked Dharma leader Bodhisattva, disciple of the Buddha, as the Buddha has said, any sentient being who receives and upholds the proper Dharma, or the genuine teaching, can be rid of all affliction. We'll go into this more. Why then, okay, another question, why then is it that some receive and uphold the Dharma, but still fail to sever themselves from them? From them, what's the them? The afflictions. Instead, they succumb to, and here we go, greed, hatred, delusion, arrogance, covering, indignation, animosity, jealousy, stinginess, deceit, and obsequiousness. What are these, by the way? Why does he list these? These are actually a partial list of the afflictions. So the afflictions in Chinese are, you can see here, fan nao, right? In the 4th line of Chinese, fan nao. In Sanskrit, it's klesha. In Pali, klesha. It's a K-I spelling. But this is a partial list of them. So we can see these are really interesting because they're really accessible, direct human qualities. These aren't abstractions or philosophically removed. These are the real things that make up our lives, make up movies, plays. Shakespeare is filled with this. And then he said, compelled by the intensity of such afflictions, they have no thought to separate from them. And yet he goes back and then he says, here's the question. How is it that one can receive and uphold the Dharma and still, within the activity, within the functioning of your mind, give rise to those afflictions? So that's the prose section, basically is posing the questions. And then if we go to then what is the verse section that follows? I mean, this is pretty simple, right? The verse section is there we go. Wow. Clarification. It's the clarification part, resolving the questions. So what you have here is a back and forth question and answer. The thing that I think is a subtle takeaway from this passage that strikes me, and maybe it strikes me because when I came in to meet the Dharma, of course, I had a lot of questions as well, but my previous religious tradition did not encourage questioning. In fact, it was quite the opposite. And the more difficult the question, the more discouraging was the reply, not to pursue that, not to answer that. And so when I came in, I was a little hesitant to pose questions. But every time my teacher would lecture or talk, or even casually if we were riding in the car on a long trip, he'd say, Yo me wanti, do you have any questions? And I thought at first that this was just sort of politeness or maybe baiting me. Well, I have a really profound question, and then but it wasn't. It was really a sincere encouragement to inquire, to investigate, to almost honor your curiosity. He wasn't interested in what I'd call sophistical questions. Do you know what's meant by sophistry? What's sophistry? Anybody? It originally means wisdom, like Sophia, but sophistry is actually pseudo-wisdom. It's pretend wisdom. It's trying to put on a show and ask supercilious questions that really don't matter, and get into a debate. And this is one of the things the Buddha really warned about, using the Dharma for sophistry and debate. He said it's a profound misuse of it. It's like, and then he gave the example, grabbing the snake from the wrong end. If you grab the snake at the tail, a poisonous snake, it will bite you. If you grab the Dharma with the idea of winning in debate and putting people down, you actually poison yourself. So there's kind of this emphasis, ask questions, but be serious about it, and ask important questions. I was remembering one question. We were in Malaysia one time, and there was someone in the audience who was a sophist. By the way, that's where sophomore comes from. Your sophomore year is, never mind. It was a sophist, and Master would say something, and he said, "Ah, yes, that's one of the 6 paramitas, but they could come, you gave the wrong order, Master Hua. They come in this order. According to Mar Ashwagandha, and according to Kumarji, blah, blah," he was going on. And this guy was going on for quite a while, and then finally he said, "I have a very important question. If everything is empty, why does one have to cultivate?" And the Master's smile says, "If everything's empty, why do you have to ask?" Boom. It just reversed the whole thing, cut him down to sort of this past this sophistry and back to the real issue. But in any event, the thing I like about this passage is that indirectly it supports the idea that the method, the key element of the Buddhist method, is not only dialogue, question and answers, but curiosity, challenging, wondering, investigating. And in this case, these verses go till the principle is exhausted, until they actually understand what this is. And someone said then there's no more questions, or they use the language, one is speechless. And one is speechless not because one is embarrassed or, how shall we say, overwhelmed. One is speechless in the way that one is satisfied. There's nothing more to talk about. How does that go on? Before awakening, many words are not enough. After awakening, one word is too many. This kind of feeling that when the awakening of the principle comes, there's a calm, but it's a calm of having answered the question. So the question seeks for and reaches clarification, and it's all occurring within this back and forth dialogue. When we set up the university, Dharma Realm Buddhist University, we purposely had a choice between, or we were at a tension at the time between making it a standard sort of college and a seminary. We were caught between those two. And Master Hua said, neither. I don't want either. I want both, but neither. And we were like, what are we to do here? And what it did was led us to basically a liberal arts model that is based on Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. Know thyself. Sift and winnow and find the truth. Look at everything widely and investigate and question and wonder and so forth. And he said, that's the Buddhist tradition as well. He said it's just a different liberal arts because liberation is a little different in this sense, but it's the same methodology. And so what we did was taking, and we found it wasn't just his inspiration, this was actually in the text themselves. If you look at the text, whether it's the Pali or the Mahayana text, you'll see there's a constant dialogical discussion going back and forth. Questions, Ananda, Shariputra asking questions, have doubts, have second thoughts, have misgivings, have further things they want clarification for, and there's always this back and forth going on. So the spirit of that is really what we took from the text and put into the university as a spirit of what we call shared inquiry, everybody together sharing and looking into it, but what the master also called developing inherent wisdom. Your inherent wisdom, the capacity to know, is there from the start, but bringing that out requires cultivation, requires asking questions, it requires getting clarification, and so forth, rubbing and polishing, you might say. So then the question wasn't so much in a seminary with doctrine and dogma what to know, but rather how to know. And this text, this Avatamsaka, is really a beautiful example of almost illustrating that methodology. So I'll just move on. So that previous passage basically said, okay, so the Buddha Dharma is the Buddha Dharma. It's of a single flavor, a single nature. And some hear it and practice vigorously and become liberated, while others just be lax and fail to get liberated. And then analogies are brought up for that. So tonight, we're going into this next section, which is one of my favorite sections. And this happened, I happened to hear this section while I was actually, along with a Buddhist nun, we were both in the assembly that night, and we were both working on our PhDs. And so we came to this section of verses, which you'll see later as we get into them why it sort of struck us at the time. But in any event, this section has the opening that I just mentioned to you, and I won't be able to go through it all tonight. But I wanted to dwell on because you've asked about memory, memorization, right? You've been asking for 3 weeks, and I promised to say something. And tonight, I'm either, I don't know if it's a promise or a threat, but I'm going to say something. By the way, this is just green tea, in case you're wondering. Some of you might be wondering, I don't know. Okay. So I wanted to look into this one piece here in the first passage, if you're looking at the Chinese, and it's it's shou-chi, right? Basically, shou-chi, zhengfa, those four characters to literally receive shou, chi. This is, by the way, the name for Heng Sure, our elder nun. It's the same chi. Zheng, and they translate it as proper, but it means, if you look at it, it's a carpenter square. So it's that which is centered, balanced, in line with the way things are, and in line with the way we might be. So it's that which leads to the authenticity, the centered, and then the Dharma. So let me just say a little bit about that, because shou-chi also is used to indicate memorization. So the chi, receive and uphold, traditionally has meant a way of studying the text that isn't simply what we're doing tonight, looking at it word by word and discursively going through it, but actually sitting down and memorizing it. In academia now, forms of like repetition, learning by heart, or ritual recitation are kind of looked down on. They're scorned a little bit because they said to stifle creativity and innovation, and they seem to entail that. But there's a whole group now of, well, a growing group of modern philosophers who are reinvestigating these ancient methods of inquiry and learning. One of them is memorization, and the other is ritual. I could spend some time talking about it, but it's really interesting. They're bringing it back, and they're bringing it back with new insights into something that has been left go for quite a while. One of these philosophers wrote, the expression to learn something by heart, like the French apprendre par cœur, to apprehend through the heart, tells us apparently that only repetition reaches the heart. Repetition stabilizes and deepens attention. This is the comment. Repetition, memorization, stabilizes and deepens attention. Then he goes on to say, it's physically experienced because you're sounding it, you're seeing it, you're sounding it. Heng Sure, when he began before a pilgrimage to the Avatamsaka, he would sound out one character and bow to that character and then come back up. And so he was memorizing, reciting, and physically experiencing and solidifying it with the bow. Then the philosopher goes on and said, they are written into the body, incorporated, that is physically internalized. Thus, rituals and memorization create a bodily knowledge and memory, an embodied identity, a bodily connection. And then he says, I'm sorry, I can go on this, digital communication is disembodied communication. But this is embodied communication. So, if we look at this in this passage that's coming up, we'll go into this in more detail. The entry into self-cultivation often began with this kind of memorization. For example, part of my training was beginning by memorizing mantras. Memorizing the mantras, let's say what are the standard memorized mantras that you've all memorized? I'm putting out a pitch tonight. If you want to get started, start with the mantras. What? Shurangama mantra. Okay, then the Great Compassion mantra. And then the 10 small mantras. If you do those, that will get you going for about a week. And after a week, we can talk about adding to that. I'm joking. But you will find that it's actually a practice of samadhi entering. It takes incredible focus and bodily mental concentration to memorize a mantra. And when you do it, it will also be you taking your pulse of your good roots. Okay? So I hate to say this and get you a little on edge, but the speed and alacrity with which you memorize is also not just your focus and concentration, but a measure of your previous conditions and good roots. Those who have really strong good roots go through this rather quickly. Those that don't, they'll start with Namo Ho, Namo Ho La, what was it again? And you just kept going until can be overcome. And the memorization process helps you overcome that weak muscle, that shallow root. It deepens the good root. And so it's really not just for spiritual reasons you're doing this, but it's for mental, physical, developmental reasons. I would say psychophysical. And by doing that, what happens is, that's the initial step, but memorization was not the final aim, but rather an important step, a preliminary qualification, allowing for deeper investigation into the text and getting and understanding its principles. So they call this part of scholarship. This was part of ancient scholarship, was to actually memorize. And you can see in many exams going back to India and China, one of the measures, and even at the University of Oxford and Cambridge in the early years, was a recitation from memorization. There wasn't even writing. This was all part of an oral tradition. Writing came actually later. And so you were memorizing and reciting text. This type of scholarship was not, the criteria for achievement was not the command of a breadth of knowledge of facts about a certain area, but the degree to which you assimilated those teachings of the sages into your body, into your behavior. That was a measure of achievement. And that's why a scholar of broad learning called Dowan, and you'll see this in the text here. I just saw the character here. The second line down below, where it says, disciple of the Buddha, listen well to the true meaning of that which we ask, but not merely by means of much learning. Dowan, you see the two characters there? Much learning, one. Does one enter this Dharma? So, the scholar of broad learning is Dowan, and this was central really to all three, at least of the East Asian classical traditions, Taoist, Confucian, and Buddhist. But Dowan was considered a lower level of entry. So you could study broadly, you could have this kind of academic knowledge, but it was the lower level. The higher level came when you actually manifested and embodied it. That was considered to be Dashui, great learning. Remember how the Dashui starts? Dashui is your PhD. No! The guy said, Ming Ming, Dashui Zherdao Zai Ming Ming Da. It means to radiate with virtue and brightness. That was the heart of the learning. There was actually scholarship involved with the text and the letters, but more important was embodying and bringing the spirit into your actual being. And this was accomplished not just by memorization, that was the first step of eating, if you will, but then was to really take it and become a living text. You actually embodied it. And so the key terms for repetition, chur, is usually rendered to observe and uphold, but it doesn't directly mean to memorize. It means internalizing the sutra, body, speech, and mind, so that you naturally embody the sutra. That's why in this text later, when they're talking about giving, and they're saying, what's the highest form of giving? Giving food, clothing, medicine is giving. Giving fearlessness is a kind of giving. Giving the Dharma is a higher kind of giving, but there's still yet a higher kind of giving. Besides giving the Dharma is, the language is Ishan Shuofa, manifesting a body that speaks the Dharma. You become the Dharma. And in that way, it's almost markless, because it's not characters or expressions or even literary skill, but it's your very being is actually an embodiment of Dharma. So this memorization is of a sutra, and I would encourage, I said the mantras, but where else could you start? To start to memorize a sutra. There we go. The Heart Sutra. Because that's, why did you mention that? Because it's profound or it's easy? or short?
It's short and I profound.
It is short, but it doesn't mean it's not profound. In fact, if you read and memorize the Heart Sutra, which I did 50 years ago, and every time I go up to Maine in the summer, that sutra comes back to me for some reason. When I'm in the woods near the lake alone, it's the Heart Sutra that keeps coming up into my consciousness. And I'm peeling it, packing it more and more, and think, gosh, I wish I'd listened to my master closely when he was explaining this. Man, what did he say about that? And why is that translated this way? And I just lose myself in the Heart Sutra in nature, but that's me. But in any event, it is short, and you can memorize it both in English and Chinese. Okay? So I know we talked about, how many have memorized that? One hand, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Does this mean kind of, or fully memorized? Go for it. You will not regret memorizing the sutra. But it's not done simply for rote learning or even a devout liturgical exercise. It's a spiritual exercise in the sense that Pierre Hadot talks about spiritual exercises. It leads to a transformation of a vision of the world and a metamorphosis of one's own personality. So this is what I wanted to start with tonight with the receiving up cold, because I promised you we'd talk a little bit about the memory thing. It also, in a very mundane sense, slows down cognitive decline. It doesn't stop cognitive decline. which is not one of the questions that they ask him. How do you stop cognitive decline? He doesn't. Don't do AI. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I wrote about this recently because we did a thing down at Cal Poly, and I was talking about cognitive capture, consciousness capture, which is the area of concern around ChatGPT and AI, that the cognitive. And then I just read this article just 2 days ago where a professor is saying the new state of college students, and the word he's used was subcognitive. It's below the cognitive activation. So this is not something I'm just making up or was aware of, although this came to me both from my teachings and studying philosophy, but now it's already out there. So now you're going to be subcogs. That'll be the new iGen, subcogs, whatever. Sorry to do that, but that's partly memorization can do is to slow down that cognitive decline. And if you say I have trouble memorizing or remembering, then even memorize more. I would say also you could add to that list, the Tao Te Ching is a wonderful text to memorize. So is the Song of Enlightenment. I can remember when my teacher sat on a couch in LA and somebody said, Master, do you know the Song of Enlightenment? And he sat back and he closed his eyes and he sang it. And Chinese poetry is supposed to be sung mostly, not just recited like we do. He sang it, and I was like, wow. And he remembered the whole thing, and it's not short. And everybody was just sort of amazed that even with all his study and learning and cultivation, he had spent a long time committing passages and text to memory, whole sutras, in fact. So if you want to sort of slow down that cognitive decline and also eat something good, eat some of these texts. You become what you eat. So this is very good. In any event, then next week I'll go into these sections, but now I wanted to go into a little poetry because I really like poetry, and the poem I wanted to read to you tonight, a couple if we have time, but this poem is from Tao Qian, or Tao Yanming again, one of my favorites. I know there's other people here that like Tao Yanming as well. I think he's a person for our time as well. I'll explain a little bit about him. Where's he from? Michigan. No. Okay, that's right. Okay. He was considered a sort of a Taoist Buddhist poet. When was he born? Around 356. Huh? Han, all right? 356, very early. He didn't meet the sixth patriarch. He was what's called a pre-Tang poet. His family was actually quite poor. And so around the age of 30, he went to work for the local government. He had enough learning, and that's what you needed at that time to pass some of the exams to get a government job. But then he resigned afterwards. And why did he resign? They didn't give him a promotion. What did you say? Bored? He wasn't necessarily bored. His moral sensibility was aroused. He felt he was unable to bear being subservient to arrogant and overbearing superiors. Now, I say he's a man for our times. He was furloughed. No, okay, so he quits his job. His wife gives birth to their first son, but dies in childbirth. And so after 2 years of mourning, he remarries, and then has 4 kids, 4 sons later. But he was always caught between bowing to these inferior superiors and making enough to support his family. And so he constantly found himself going back into Silicon Valley going into Wall Street, going into Washington, going into, government positions and then pulling back again. because he would go in, I got to support the kids and the family. I cannot take this anymore. You know, it just bothers him too much. And then he was in position, and then in 396, the emperor was strangled. Now, I don't mean rhetorically, he was literally strangled. So this was a primitive form of impeachment, I guess, removal from office. And then who took over the throne? Who would have been his superior? A 5-year-old kid. But the 5-year-old kid had no power, but he was the face of the throne. And then there was a bunch of rebellious, intrigue, fighting people behind him. And he said, I can't endure this compromise to my integrity anymore. And then he finally becomes a recluse farmer. That's a term that's used. He tried one more time when he was so destitute, because farming, I know some of you who don't grow up on a farm like I did think, oh, farming, the idyllic life, Thoreau writing and reading books in the pasture under the trees, the chickens in the morning bringing eggs to you for breakfast, and the cows delivering warm, fresh milk, sometimes chocolate. No, farming is hard. It's hard work. I watched my family on the farm. You grow old very easily fast. You get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. You don't go to... My uncle and my grandfather fell asleep in their bib overhauled in their chairs with their boots still on, and they're at 9 or something in the evening, and at 3 o'clock they were up again. They didn't even bother to change their clothes. And they took no vacations, because if you got cattle and cows that you have to milk and take care of and fields you have to tend, this is not idyllic pastoral life. This is very, very tough. So I think maybe it's not here, but the recluse farmer thing was tougher than he might have thought. And so he decided he would try once more to be an official. He was a magistrate. And he lasted 80 days. And he said, even if I starve to death on a farm, it's better than living in this kind of society. So he retired to a place called near Lu Mountain, and 20 years he led a simple life, supporting his family through farming. And he wrote a great deal of poetry besides, and we only have about 120 of his poems left that survive to this day. But he was a precursor to a group of poets that were called, I don't know the Chinese exactly, I can say what it is, it's Tengyun Sure, which basically means pastoral or countryside or rural or rustic poetry. The American equivalent I was going to read tonight, if we have time, is, anybody know an American equivalent to pastoral poetry? Going once, going twice. Who? William Barry? Yeah. Yes, Barry is one. Anybody else earlier? Robert Frost. And a modern one would be Mary Oliver. Thoreau. These are some of our pastoral poets. What defines them is very interesting. They draw inspiration from the landscape and the simple rustic people in the rural area. And yet they're able to imbue their works with really profound themes. Loss, choice, search for meaning, mortality, and so forth. So this one I want to read to you tonight is kind of following on the lax part of last week. Why not to be lax? But it's Tao Yan Ming's reflection. And I'm sorry, I don't have the Chinese, but I'm sure some of you, because you've memorized Tao Yan Ming, as soon as I start this, you'll know the Chinese. Okay. So here's his poem. Too poor to hire help. We're being taken over by a wilderness tangle of trees. All silence. Birds drifting, clear skies, and isolate silence. There's no sign of others. Time and space go on forever, but who lives to even 100? Months and years tighten, bustling each other away, and my hair was already turning white long ago. If we don't give up failure and success, that promise we hold just turns to regret. So everything's going along this line. He says, too poor to hire help. Literally in times, it not only meant servants, could mean also a chase lounge to be carried in. It's one of those phrases that has a couple meanings. But clearly, he's no longer being carried around in a chair, which was reserved for magistrates and aristocracy. We're being taken over by a wilderness tangle of trees. In other words, nature is competing with him to arable use of the land. There's this profound silence, birds drifting in clear skies, an isolated silence, or even perhaps a little loneliness. There's no sign of others. It means he's really removed from the marketplace and the hustle and bustle. Time and space go on forever. It's this idea there's no clock or calendar except the seasons and the days. But who lives even to 100? So he says time and space and this vastness, and yet right within this is human mortality. Months and years tighten as I get older. This is a very interesting expression. They tighten, they seem to be coming faster and faster, bustling each other away, and my hair was already turning white long ago. Now the last line, which is the closer. If we don't give up success and failure, that promise we hold just turns to regret. This is really deep. Success and failure means winning, gaining, material success, food, fame, wealth, sex, this kind of thing. Being number one in the world, in government. He says, if we don't give up these superficial ideas of success and failure, the promise we hold just turns to regret. What's the promise? What's the promise we hold? What does he mean by that? It's a very interesting line. Huh? Deep potential, the promise we hold. If it's not success and failure, if it's not material accomplishment, it's not being number one, getting elected to high office, getting your IPO out there and making a killing on the market, that kind of success and failure, what is the promise then? What's he talking about? Now remember, he's a Taoist Buddhist in his orientation. What is the promise of the human? Huh? Freedom. Liberation, freedom. You could say awakening, enlightenment, uniting with your spiritual nature. That is a promise we hold. And then his line is very interesting. I folded over more pages. No, I can't. What was the last line again? The promise we hold what? Just turns to regret. So you remember Huineng, and it had a very similar line. He says, a frantic passage through life, in other words, the third kind of laxity, busyness, ends in bitter regret. So both are saying basically the same thing. The frantic passage through life, bitter regret, the promise we hold if we don't carpe diem, so to speak. You know that expression, carpe diem? Seize the day, seize the time. So, yeah. Anyway, this is Tao Ming. His famous poem, when he finally went to the farm, is called The Return. And that's, everybody is familiar with that. I'm going home, my fields and gardens are choked with weeds, why should I not return? My mind has been a slave to my body, but why should I remain melancholy? So forth. That's when he finally goes and leaves. But now he's still using nature to reflect and unite with his own nature. And also maybe a sort of cautionary about laxity. This came up this week when I was saying they ask questions, asking questions. And there's a great line from the Buddha Charita where the Buddha sort of chides his father. He says, Dad, how can you sit there just eating and enjoying yourself and thinking about a future for me when the whole world is on fire? How can you be comfortable sitting there? And he meant this, everything's burning with impermanence, passing, fleetingness. There's nothing solid or substantial. So this week, when I say they ask questions, I was having dinner with some old friends, colleagues. These are two professors that I first stayed with when I came back to California in the 70s. And they're now getting white hair as well. uh, and one of them went back to Beijing to take care of her parents. And her parents now are in their late 80s, early 90s. And they have the wherewithal to really get a nice retirement home. And she got the very best for them. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm guessing it's pretty classy. There's a swimming pool, there's a spa, there's all these games you can play, there's big television screens, the food is to die for. I mean, not literally, because they're, yeah. Anyhow, her father is basically almost blind and deaf, cannot walk, and still keeps trying to go out the front door back to their old apartment. And she was going, what is with you, Dad? I got this great place for you. You're asking Mom to take care of you, and she's almost 90 and can hardly, you're still depending on her. Why? And he said, I'm just not comfortable here. I want to go back to my home and whatnot. And she said, and she's a scientist, so she was trying to rationally make sense of what this was. And finally, we were sitting down talking. She said, I figured it out. I said, what was it? What is it? She said, mortality. Mortality. He's afraid of dying. And being in that old folks' home with all those old people, it kind of reminds him that this is where it's all going, and he doesn't want to. And she said, and then she asked this question, what is that about, and what should I answer? And I thought, there's the big question. You know, you're a scientist investigating, and what is the answer to this question is where, and I said, you know what? That is where all philosophy begins. Plato, for example, said the whole purpose of philosophy is to have knowledge and investigate the inevitability of one's own death. Philosophy arises from that one question. And so it was really interesting at the table. Nobody, I mean, I can't go say cultivate because it's not the climate, but, and then you could see both her and her husband's face like, we too will be going down that road as well, and we can't answer that. So in any way, I didn't go on. Houston Smith, remember I talked about Houston Smith, a religious scholar, and we became friends, very close friends, towards the end of his life. And he was taken out of his home and put in an old folks' home here in Berkeley. And I would go visit him there. And he too was very unhappy there. I was trying to get back to his home, which I'm not going to go into detail how he got. This is because we're streaming this. So. Any event, there he is, not happy. And I go to visit him one day in his room, and he's got a book out, and he's looking at the book, and it's a kind of a medieval manuscript, and there's an art piece on there. How shall I explain it? Like a lithograph of some sort, and it shows a monk in a room, and the monk is holding a skull in his hands and looking at it. Very much like the scene out of Shakespeare, Hamlet, right? Looking at the skull of the jester. And he says, and Houston has a very deliberate slow voice. He said, Marty, do you know what that is? I said, no, I haven't seen that before. He said, in the past, cultivators would contemplate things like skulls to remind them of their mortality. And I said, oh. And we walked out the door, and he said, Marty, I don't need a skull. I said, oh, really? He said, and he looked left and right down the hallway. He says, this whole place is a skull. You know, obviously he still had his wits about him to make that observation. In any event, he did finally go home, and he passed away. Whether he answered the question of what it was or what it wasn't, you know, because he was born in China. He was born to missionary parents in China. And then I was with him in the last days, and I could remember there was a peace he attained. Now, he was really a scholar of all religions, but meditated every day, and was very excited. Gave his whole library to us here at the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery. And I remember he was in bed, and he had these curtains on his windows that were just blowing gently in the breeze like this. You know, I associate with farm curtains. We had curtains on the farm were not stiff; they were just fluid silk-like. and the wind was blowing and people were walking by, and he was just looking, and then he turned to me and he said, "Are you still in harness?" I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Are you still teaching?" You're not a recluse farmer, in other words. You haven't retired. And I said, "No." And he says, "Ah." He said, "Well, it's something to look forward to." He says, "Now I sit here and look out my window and watch the world, busy world, go up and down, passing by. And I'm just very calm and at peace as I watch this transpire." And then a few days later, he just passed away. So I don't know that he had an answer or didn't have an answer, but he did not end with the promise not pursued. He took whatever that was and pursued it right to his last breath. And maybe whatever he embodied came out in that tranquility that he showed at the end. It wasn't a message of telling me what truth or what the answer to mortality was or anything. It was just an expression of some kind of peace and equanimity that he attained in his investigations that allowed him to move on. And he did not believe that death was an end. It was just another change or transformation. So very interesting stuff. I could go on. I had a poem from Robert Frost, but we ran out of time tonight. So maybe I'll share it with you next week. And then next week we'll go back into these verses, which I really like, and I'll explain why they resonated with this nun who was Heng Sure. Do you remember Heng Sure? She just passed away a couple years ago. Pu Shen Shen. She was doing her PhD in Sanskrit at Cal at the time, and I was doing mine at Wisconsin at the time, but we were in the Buddha Hall that night when this passage came up, and it really struck both of us very, very vividly. Actually changed our hearts. And actually, 20, 30 some years later, I just mentioned, she says, "Yes, I remember that night." So anyhow, any questions, comments? Sorry I went over and kept you from your trick-or-treat parties, but nothing? Announcements? Denouncements? Things coming up? Ken, is there anything to announce? Any retreats or? Guanyin session coming up when? When? This Sunday starts a Guanyin session. Ah, okay. And so can we, I mean, you don't have to, but if you memorize something, just kind of let me know. You can drop me a line, or I can make you feel very comfortable and have you stand up and recite it from memory here. Now I'll get no lines, no, drop it. But seriously think about doing this. There's so many ways to waste your time, and this is not a waste of time. And in fact, in the tradition, this is how the texts were passed along for almost 300 some years, was from memorization, not from writing. We gain something by writing, but we also lose something. So, okay, that being said, you're free to go. I will do the transference in English. Those of you who don't know the transference, I think there's who doesn't know it? So that you could, a little card, okay. Connie, could you pass out some cards? Yes. For the transference? Thank you. Just raise a hand if you need a card. No. It's just a little plastic card. It's coming. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light. the fruits of peace, with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our hearts awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the triple jewel.